Hello everyone and welcome to our Rural and Remote COVID-19 series. My name is Adam Coltzau. I'm going to be your host for tonight's panel. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet right across Australia, acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. That acknowledgement is particularly important today on National Sorry Day, acknowledging the apology that was given to the stolen generation. And it's particularly important that we acknowledge any Indigenous owners of the lands right across Australia that are joining us tonight on this webinar. Welcome to our 8th in a series of Rural Remote Response for COVID-19 webinars. On behalf of the RDAA in Akron, we've had a great response to our webinar series so far. And tonight, our webinar is concentrating on disaster preparedness and that response. My name is Adam Coltzau. I'm a rural journalist from St George in southwestern Queensland, a town that's not uncommon to disasters. Rural doctors right across Australia play a vital role in their communities in the management of disasters, whether or not that's a local bus crash, floods, bushfires, or in this case, a pandemic. Rural GPs are at the forefront and the centre of many local disaster responses. Many are involved in the local disaster management, involved in local disaster planning with their hospital or health service, or their own local practice. Many give advice for regional, local, state and federal responses. But this is not always even right across Australia. It differs greatly across the states and even within certain regions of the same state. Tonight, we've got an exceptional panel lined up for you that includes Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons, who led the New South Wales Rural Fire Service through the horrific fires of 2019-2020. Shane is now the New South Wales Resilience Commissioner and the Deputy Head of Emergency Management in the Premier's Department of New South Wales. Joining him is Professor Brendan Murphy, who you all know as the Chief Medical Officer, who's currently leading Australia through the pandemic response for COVID-19. Tonight he appears without his famous flattening the curve graph from the comfort of his own home. Dr Kate Manderson from Nowra in New South Wales is currently involved in the medical response in her own community. Kate was heavily involved in the summer bushfires and has some first-hand experience of disaster response and coordination work across her area. Before we get started, if you'd like to send through some questions, click on the little Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. That'll open the window and you can type in some questions and we can feed that through into our panelists. Right, let's get straight into it. So we might cut straight to the chase and go straight into questions for our panel. A lot of disaster management, you know, you're all fairly experienced in it. How much of it is good planning and preparation and how much of that is policy on the run? Can you ever really be fully prepared for a disaster? And, you know, tell us a little bit about your experiences in the last 6 months or so. So, Professor Murphy, might go to you first, eh?
Thanks, Adam. So I think I can give my experiences based on the COVID outbreak, really. And I think it's a nice example of preparedness and policy on the run. You know, we had a pretty good system of preparedness that was dependent on a functioning federation, which is quite tricky because most of our public health response sits in the states and territories, yet the Commonwealth coordinates it. So we had established mechanisms, the Health Protection Principal Committee, the Public Health Laboratory Network, various expert committees. And so we were in a good place in January to sort of activate those systems. We cultured the virus first, we got tests going early, we set up. So a lot of those things that we had practiced, we had a we used our existing influenza pandemic plan as the basis for our COVID plan. And so a lot of the reason for our success, we had a really good established system of national coordination and preparedness in a lot of spaces. But then on the other hand, there were lots of things that were very new. For example, the best example of that is that traditionally in the pandemic flu plan, the WHO, most of the Western countries would say, you never close the borders, it's a waste of time, it doesn't achieve anything. Probably the most successful thing we've done, if I point to one of them, was closing our borders. That was what really broke the back of importation of cases. Pandemic flu plans depend on controlling the outbreak until you get a vaccine. This plan, we don't have a clear plan at the moment. As I've often said in the media, you might have heard me say it, that we're, unlike most countries, we've got ourselves on a life raft. The US and the UK are still swimming around in the water, but we're not entirely sure where to direct it. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of policy we've developed on the run, how to test, how to respond, how far to go. You know, we could have done what New Zealand did and locked down their economy completely for 2 months with not even takeaway food, no construction, everything shut. We went halfway, and we're in about the same position, but none of us really know what the right thing is. So I think it's a nice combination of both. You've got to have a plan, but it's got to be incredibly flexible.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Kate, you want to have a crack at answering that?
Yeah, definitely. And just to follow on from what Professor Murphy has just said, that you've got to have a plan that's got to be flexible, that effective plans and effective policy on the run becomes even more effective when it's built on a really solid foundation of background and of readiness, so that when it's time to enact your plan, you've got people who know what they're doing and how they're doing it, they're resourced and they're supported to do it. So when the disaster evolves and changes, which it will by its very nature, you're ready to do the on the run bit. You're trained, you've done all the prep, and you can be that much more ready. So it's a balance of that preparation and the troubleshooting and the catastrophizing sometimes, what could possibly go wrong, to get ready. And then when the disaster happens, it sometimes can be anticlimactic, but it's not as bad as it was going to be, like maybe we've established with COVID-19, because we're building on a really solid foundation of preparedness. It's that balance for sure.
Thanks, Kate. Shane, you've led many disasters. Do you want to talk us through this one?
Look, I would echo very similar to Brendan and Kate. Planning is fundamental. You need foundational planning, preparation, but the key to planning is contemplation, is scenario forecasting and thinking what might happen. And as we often say in fire and emergency services, disaster planning, you plan for the worst and hope for the best. And it is about inclusion. It is about buy-in, locally led planning instruments that frame up into in my case, a state framework or a national framework. And we saw that through this last fire season. The planning instruments were executed very well, but there's no doubt the unprecedented nature of the fire season saw scale, complexity, gravity of the circumstances go beyond what is normally the case. And bushfires in Australia are well practiced. So there is a lot of, people say policy on the run, and I agree with that to a certain extent, but I think that's often confused with making considered, difficult, necessary decisions as you're going along in the disaster, in the circumstances, to accommodate the circumstances and adapt and be agile to the circumstances that are unfolding. So you need a bit of both, in my view.
So I'll ask the next question to all of you as well. What is the big thing that surprised you the most over the last 6 months in the disasters you've really been involved with? Jane, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, for me, particularly through the bushfires and now with the COVID and my new role with the COVID recovery work, the overwhelming thing that stood out to me was the extraordinary resilience of people and local communities. And despite the extraordinary tragedy, damage, destruction, despair, we also saw the very best in humanity. We saw an outpouring of love and support and care and assistance, everything from people standing up day after day, week after week, month after month, putting themselves between fire fronts and people's livelihoods, people's valuables, and people themselves, right through to recovery and relief centres where people would turn up and offer strangers and neighbours accommodation for the night and help with meals and all those fundamental things. And when you talk with people that have lost everything they've ever owned and ever worked for, some people, I've told the story, catching up with somebody, it's pretty confronting when they say, Shane, I've lost everything. I can't even prove my identity. I don't have a wallet. I can't get money out of my bank account. There's some really confronting issues when it comes to people, but the resilience of people, the commitment and the dedication, the outpouring of love and support to look out for themselves, their neighbours, broader communities, and indeed strangers, has been the thing that has impressed me extraordinarily. And I've also seen that extend into the COVID environment with the easing of restrictions and getting out. I'm seeing a very pleasant and welcome, what I would describe as an improved level of civility. There's a courtesy, there's a patience, there's a suite of manners that are going about our daily business when you're getting on board transport, when you're going to buy something. So to me, the thing that stood out to me was people and how remarkable they were, despite the adversity, despite the challenge, and how willing they were, if we're honest and open and candid about the risk and what we're doing and why we're doing it, what we can't do, why we can't do it, and what we really need them to do. People across our affected areas have responded remarkably in my view.
Thanks, Shane. Brendan, what do you think surprised
Yeah,
you the most?
very similar, actually. It's the Australian community response. If you look at America, where people are invading legislatives with guns saying end the lockdown, the Australian community, despite when we did the physical distancing measures, it was we introduced a whole lot of change over about a 10-day period. Getting the states together was interesting and quite challenging to get a consistent narrative, but the Australian community responded extraordinarily. And we've got all of the physical distancing movements were really implemented very well. In fact, sometimes more than we intended. A lot of retail closed because people just weren't turning up. We didn't ever close retail. And yet there was also an innovativeness that you look at the way restaurants have done takeaway in the last month. It's been extraordinary. They've got whole new exciting models. And we've had very little pushback from the community. And if you track, all the tracking on public transport on Google and Apple, and people have really complied. And whilst there's always bits of talks of police having to go and do things, that's at the margins. Mostly the community have stood behind us, and they're not all that impatient some of them are, to unlock. So I think that's surprised me just at how much the community has been with us and how they've all turned up to get testing in the last few weeks when we've been pushing testing, which to me is one of the most important things that we've got to do over the coming months to make sure we pick up any outbreaks. So the Australian community has been a great pleasant surprise for me too.
Kate, what surprised you the most in the last 6 months, do you think?
So I think to echo the community theme, I shouldn't be surprised, and I suppose I wasn't that surprised. I was delighted, in fact, that the warmth of the community in pulling together and banding together, going back to bushfires again, the local chaps who put on the ferry to get us all across Currumbeen Creek so we could get home by themselves. The community saw a need. They bridged that gap all by themselves without being asked or tasked or directed to do that. And similarly, when it was starting to get pretty real down in Jarvis Bay, the community coming along to the RFS briefing, really strong turnout and really warmly encouraging each other to contribute and to get involved. I'm going to rain on everyone's parade a little bit, because the other thing that surprised me was the lack of that engagement at the higher levels and the organisational level. So the community was there and stepping up and wanting to get involved and doing a beautiful job. But when the community wanted to tap into some higher level resources, then there's some barriers went up. And that surprised me, which was a shame. But hey, that's the point of why we're here and why we're talking about this stuff now, is to say, well, what can we learn from that? So.
Thanks, Kate. So that leads us straight into the next question perfectly. So RDAA and ACRIM have been really quite vocal in calling for improved integration of GPs and rural generalists into disaster response. Whether it's mass casualty, large-scale bushfires, or whatever it is. How do you think this can be achieved? And is there appetite at a federal and state level of governments to really facilitate this? So, Kate, I might ask you to go first on this. You've got some experience as a rural doctor in disaster, as you just alluded to, with getting that voice heard of the GP on the ground. So do you want to go first in answering this?
Sure, thank you. So I think with getting the voice heard from the GP on the ground is to listen to the GP on the ground, and you can't listen if the voices aren't being invited to contribute. So having an open forum and an opportunity for not just the GPs, but the communities and the community healthcare workers, so the practice nurses, the community nurses and so on, giving them an opportunity to make a contribution in a way that is meaningful and is then going to be translated into action. And knowing that, I suppose, you can trust that community to know, and that healthcare community to know what it is that they can do, also to know what they can't do and what they need to be able to bridge that gap. And it comes back to the preparedness piece. So we can let you know, I can do this, I can't do that. But if you train me and support me to do the other, then we can get it all done. So there's got to be an opportunity and an avenue for the rural GPs to be able to have a seat at the table and then take us seriously and then help us to make it happen. And the next time the bushfires come around, next season potentially, we're going to be in a much, much better place.
Brendan, what do you think we can do to further integrate GPs?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, we, from the outset of the COVID outbreak, we absolutely saw a critical role for GPs, because we saw from the beginning that if we weren't identifying and capturing and locking down outbreaks, we'd be stuffed. And there's no way, whilst you can set up, clinics in the car parks of big hospitals in Sydney and Melbourne, the health system outside of metro is GPs. And so that's why we very much sought to set up these GP-led respiratory clinics and to try and engage. That's why one of the reasons I brought Michael Kidd on into the department to lead primary care reform, and he arrived from Toronto, and I said, Michael, forget primary care reform at the moment. You're dealing with one of the most critical things we've got, is to engage GPs in our response. And even now, I would say that if one of the keys to our success over the next 4 to 5, 6, 12 months or whatever, till we get a vaccine, is for us to have a really alert and engaged general practice to pick up and test every single person with any sort of respiratory symptom. That's the way we're going to find these outbreaks and contain them. So in this, obviously in the COVID situation, which is very much a public health disaster, you know, you'd be bloody mad not to give GPs a central role, and that's why we've been trying our best to communicate and to engage GPs and to listen to GPs. You know, and all sorts of. It's been an extraordinary wild ride of policy on the run, telemedicine, pathology tests, dealing with anxiety about PPE and all that sort of stuff. But I think at the end of it all, we probably should sit back and reflect and think about how we do engage GPs in a more structured way for a future issue. I mean, I think we in the Commonwealth, we have tended to use the primary health networks, and that's in some respects, and that's partly effective, not always effective, but we've now done a lot of direct engagement with GPs and through the colleges. And you know, if we don't engage GPs, we're not engaging the health system. You know, for vast parts of the country. So I think it would be a useful exercise when this is all over to sit down and think about how we can create some structures to do it better, because we did have to create a lot of policy on the run early in this outbreak. You know, and we had to engage people to go out and find who was, you know, for example, who was interested in setting up these clinics, and we had to do a sort of quite a cumbersome process to find that out. We should have known that beforehand. So I think that'll be an interesting exercise too.
Shane, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, the best planning is locally led, locally derived. The best operations are locally led, locally derived. The best recovery and rebounding effort is locally led, locally derived, which is why a lot of the planning and the operations and the recovery programs are all facilitated through local planning constructs, which feed into regional and state-based, Commonwealth-based arrangements. There's no doubt over my years, and whilst it's predominantly the purview of health as one of our stakeholders in the fire management and planning environment, but even as Commissioner in the Royal Fire Service, I would often find myself meeting with GPs in rural and regional areas, particularly where communities have been impacted by fires, because they were a very good indicator of community sentiment, of community well-being, of issues that are emerging that may not be readily visible to others. So there's no doubt, even as we're doing now with the extraordinary recovery and rebuilding effort, local area health, local networks, additional resources, GPs, they are working and engaging together, along with local council-led, non-government organisations, community-led organisations, lots of initiative, lots of nuanced programs, and what is good in one area is not necessarily the model for another area, but the principles and the arrangements in terms of engaging local capacity is fundamental, and I see GPs very much a part of that, whether it's a health matter or a related disaster or crisis.
Thanks, Shane. Of course, it's fairly important that if you're in a disaster area or if you're in practice anywhere, that each practice should have its own disaster management plan, a business plan, those sorts of things. And in order to get GPs greater integrated into disaster planning, it's important that you start with a disaster plan for your own practice. So we've been doing a fair bit of that work with RDAA, so we'll put some stuff out around that fairly soon. We've got a heap of questions from the audience tonight, so I might try and get to some of those now. So one from Ewan. While the responses we've seen and learned some lessons from overseas, whether it's bushfires or pandemic, what is it about Australia, do you think, that's been quite unique in the way we've done our response that we've done so well? Australia's done particularly well in the pandemic, and Australia did particularly well in the bushfires compared to other countries like Italy and California. So I might ask each of you to quickly comment on why you think, what is unique about Australia and why we've done so well in those responses. Brendan, do you want to go first in regard to the pandemic?
Yeah, so this is a question that I get asked a lot. I think it's multifactorial. One is that we were prepared and we had one of the best public health networks. So we actually got the PCR test for COVID up before the end of January, and we were able to pick up and detect and isolate those early cases that came out of China. That was the big difference between us and Italy and the UK and the US. They didn't have the testing up. They weren't looking for cases, and we locked them down. And the second thing we did was we had a really good, we built a really good public health response. Some states were a bit behind the others, but they all invested. We went from a public health response team of what was probably a couple of hundred nationwide to now something that's nearly 10,000. We've got a hugely surged contact tracing public health workforce. So the testing, the contact tracing, and then we are an island, which helped, and then the border measures. And as I said before, no, we were seriously criticised. The UK were not happy. They said, why are you closing your borders? It's of no value. WHO said the same, but that was what broke the back. We were getting something like 100 international cases a day landing in Australia and spreading disease. So the border measures made a huge difference. And I think the fact that our governments at every level listened to the health advice, which was really remarkable. When you look around the world, and that hasn't happened in a lot of countries. So those are the major things. And we have a very good health system. It may not be as well connected as we'd like, but it has wonderful safety nets, and we were able to, working with the Intensive Care Society. Fortunately, we didn't need those 7,000 ICU beds that I planned for, but gee, they came to the party. They mapped out where they could create beds. We manufactured ventilators, and there was a huge sort of spirit of cooperation. And so the Federation worked really well. So it's been a very rewarding experience for me.
Thanks, Brendan. Shane, what do you think is unique about Australia that was so successful in a lot of these disaster responses?
Oh, to me, there's a couple of things that stand out, not dissimilar to what Brendan talked about, but firstly, we have these legislation frameworks, these legislative frameworks and these policy constructs that ensure that we're complementing and coordinating resources and effort with all that is available across government and across community. I remember decades ago, disasters, emergencies and everything. Ironically, there was lots of turf wars and egos about who was in charge of what and all that sort of thing. We've matured enormously over the decades, and the experiences and the lessons have genuinely been factored into our operating frameworks, underpinned by legislation, but also the policy constructs. I think the other thing that we take for granted in Australia that is so extraordinarily powerful is the sense of community and volunteerism. Volunteerism is the front runner to so much that occurs in society, and I would challenge anybody to look in their community and think of something that works and works well, whether it's health, whether it's care of people, whether it's support to the caring and support of people, whether it's our education networks, our sporting networks, our environment and land care provisions, you name it. And of course, our fire and emergency services, they are underpinned by volunteers. And as a matter of fact, the national body for fire and emergency services represents 30 odd agencies across the country and New Zealand. And they represent a workforce of about 300, 400,000 people, and 90% of them are volunteers. It's a very powerful figure when you look at what happens in terms of what we do and how we do it. So with that culture, with that sense of community, there is a strong commitment, there's a strong dedication, there's an extraordinary agility and adaptiveness and resourcefulness that makes for a solution-focused and outcome-focused commitment by people to get the job done, not procrastinate, argue, you know, and bicker about things like we see in some other areas. And I can say from personal experience, having travelled around in different parts of the world where they've sought insights, that framework, that operating environment is recognised and is somewhat, we are the envy of many places of the world in terms of how our people pull together and focus on community and community wellbeing.
Kate, what are your thoughts representing all average GPs all across Australia? What's unique about the Australian environment that's been so good about our response to every sort of disaster we've tackled?
Well, Adam, there's nothing average about GPs, you know that. I echo a little bit of what Shane just said. We really, Australians, not just GPs, have a remarkable capacity to figure it out, to find a way to crack on and get it done. And a little bit of that taps into that volunteerism piece, which I absolutely agree with, where nobody pays us to work after hours and on weekends to figure out a way to keep our practices open and to keep our practices safe. It was never an option for us to stop seeing patients. We just figured out a way to crack on and to get it done and to deliver that in a completely changed way. Agile, resilient, all those words we keep using, but they actually describe the primary care workforce in Australia really quite well. The transition from face-to-face to telehealth, I think Greg Hunt said it was 3 decades worth of change in the way we deliver healthcare that was delivered in a matter of days. And we figured it out and we found a way to do it and we got it done. And we are particularly good at doing that. We are tough and we are very good at doing that sort of thing.
Thanks, Kate. The questions are really pouring in and I'm trying to sort of condense some of them. A couple of them are fairly specifically just for you, Brendan. There's been 5 questions so far. When do you think the borders might open between states and internationally? We can keep it as cheap as you want.
So I'm hoping the interstate borders will open soon. And I think as the epidemiology settles in Victoria and New South Wales, Queensland I think will be first. And, my bet is that they might try and open in the middle of the year. South Australia and Tasmania might follow. West Australia will be later. I think they have a lot of value in their border measures. And then the one that's probably going to be the longest is the Northern Territory, because they've removed the special restrictions we put on remote Indigenous communities, and they feel very strongly that their high proportion of Indigenous population is protected by the borders. But HPPC has never recommended internal border closures. Those states have taken it on themselves on the basis that they've seen the epidemiology is worse in New South Wales and Victoria, basically, and they wanted to stop those people coming, or at least coming only in quarantine. International borders is a very different issue. We're working on the New Zealand bubble, which you've heard about. We'd hope to get some international travel with New Zealand going by the middle of the year. There may be some other countries, interestingly, Vietnam's in a really good place. Republic of Korea might be, but generally speaking, it looks hard. I can't see a broad relaxation of the international borders, in the foreseeable future, or even potentially this year. So we're going to be living in this isolated. Clearly, we'll increase our international traffic. We want to try and get some of the international students back, but broad tourism is quite a long way off, and I don't have the answer to that question, but I'm hoping state borders will be open pretty soon.
Thank you. Kate, I might get you to have a first crack at the PHN question that's been asked. How have you found engagement with your local PHN and how effective do you think it's been? Sorry, that's a summary of a couple of questions there. And then I might come to you, Brendan, on how you found PHN performance. Okay.
I kind of need to declare an interest because I was part of the agency that established our PHN locally, but put that to one side. Look, just today I took delivery from our PHN of some really useful PPE resupply for our respiratory clinic. And they, I've got to say, during the bushfires, I think there was a lot to be desired in terms of the PHN being ready and able to respond in the immediate sense to the needs of the community who were being threatened by fire and couldn't access healthcare. That was a challenge. Flipping now across to recovery and some of the mental health recovery and the recovery work, the PHN is doing some really strong work there. And now moving forward into the pandemic, again, I think it was a bit of a slow start, but I think they're starting really to establish a good way of doing things. Again, from me personally, with a respiratory clinic and their support in setting that up and engaging with a PHU and then resupply for PPE, and just being willing to listen and to respond to emails and to pick up the phone. They've been really good. So bushfires, immediate stuff, not so much. Recovery, pandemic, they've been pretty good locally.
Brendan, how have you found the PHNs?
So I think the PHNs are still evolving. They're still relatively new, and every time I engage with primary care and community, I get a range of views from we love our PHN to we think our PHN could do better. And I think there is a spectrum of performance across the nation, but I think as a group they are getting their act together. I think it's been in disaster management, emergency management generally, they've had to change their mindset from being, you know, essentially a business hours operation into a rapidly responsive, flexible organisation. Some of them have done that really well. Some of them, I think, as you heard, took a while to sort of respond to that. I think when we originally went to them and said, you're going to be the people who give the PPE out to primary care, we've got no other good mechanism. Some of them said, yes, we're up for it. And some of them said, no, it's all too difficult. But eventually they all came to the party. And I think the experience of the bushfires and the pandemic has probably matured the PHNs. They're certainly collectively they've wanted to help. And I think, as I said, I think they're still growing. And I hope that they will get better and better. And obviously the sensible ones have really good engagement with their GPs and listen to the voice of the general practice.
Thanks, Brendan. A quick question, which isn't quick, so I won't read it all out, about the number of vaccines that have been trialled. What's your best guess from when we might see a vaccine?
Yeah, I'm a little more hopeful in the last few weeks. There are, over 100 candidate molecules. There's the adenovirus one at Oxford is being trialled. It's gone straight to phase 3 trials. We're doing phase 1 trials for one of the recombinant molecules. There are a number of recombinant vaccines that have produced in experimental animals what looks like it could be an immune response. Now, clearly, getting a good candidate vaccine that works in experimental animals is the big hurdle, but then the other big hurdle is the phase 3 trial safety testing and then ramping up production. If it's a recombinant vaccine, we're working closely with CSL to have them prepare to turn their Broadmeadows blood products factory into making one, if we can deal with all the intellectual property issues. So it's hard to imagine it'll be available broadly this calendar year, but I'm hopeful for next calendar year sometime. But I think everyone has to recognise that there's still a possibility we won't get one. That the work on SARS and MERS vaccines did not produce one. But having said that, the effort that's going in internationally into the vaccine area is just huge at the moment, and if it's possible to make a vaccine, I think we will have a pretty good idea in the next few months.
Thanks, Brendan. We've got a heap of questions here that basically saying thank you to both you and Shane for leading us through this, what's been a pretty ordinary start for 2020. Couple of questions. I'll summarise about 4 comments all into one and ask probably all 3 of you. You know, you've had to front the cameras each day, you have to do press each day, the nation sees your face each day, and we all also see the human that's behind that and see the fatigue, the stress, the lack of sleep at times. How have you personally dealt with that fatigue, stress, lack of sleep in front of the cameras each day? Brendan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's been an interesting. I mean, I'm finding it the most extraordinary thing is that I now put on a cap and sunglasses when I go for a walk because I get recognised, and it's really unusual. I think the most important thing has been to try not to get too anxious about what you're doing, your decisions, to try and keep telling yourself that I'm not individually responsible for any real decision. I've worked very strongly with a collective of public health physicians in AHPPC, and my task has been to get a consensus opinion. Many of them are better qualified than I am in public health, and I want to honestly convey that view. The media has been interesting. You know, we had a lot of very anxious people early on when the outbreak, and a lot of it, you know, quite difficult attacks in the media, but I've not taken any of it personally. And all you can do is do your best and try and, you know, I've been the last month, I've tried to take Saturdays off, which has been good, to try and get a bit of time back. I'm desperately trying to deal with my conflict of interest in wanting to get gyms open again, because I'd love to get back there. But it's been the thing that I've found most tricky is being recognised everywhere, and it's quite an uncomfortable situation. I'm sure Shane has found the same, and we're both used to having Auslan interpreters standing next to us, which is quite an unusual thing and very nice actually.
Shane, how have you found that coping with fatigue, stress, and the lack of sleep, etc., running the media each day?
It's funny, Adam, because despite the crazy hours and the relentless nature of the fire season campaign, which literally went on for month after month after month, there was just it was 7 days a week, month after month. We didn't even recognise Christmas, New Year or anything. It was just a pattern. And you do get tired, but there is such I don't know what it is, adrenaline, there's such a focus, there's a sense of purpose and belonging to deliver the best you can in the most dire of circumstances. And the thing that really stuck in my mind was I was getting up at 4:30 every morning, probably to get 4:30 I was up and getting into the office, getting the briefings ready to go for the day, often not getting home till very late at night. But I never once had to rely on the alarm waking me up. I went to bed, I'd set the alarm, but I was awaken up before my alarm went off. So there's something innate in the body clock that clicks in, and when you've really got to focus on the task at hand. Like Brendan, surrounded by extraordinary people, very clever people, very, very professional people, a massive team of people, a unity of purpose and focus across agencies, government, non-government, our political masters. There's something very reassuring about having strong political support and leadership partnering with you when you're making really big decisions that have direct implications for the functioning of society. And of course, during the fires, the worst of tragedies for us. 26 people officially died in New South Wales. I think it was 33 at a national level, 34 now probably, with the extra person in New South Wales attributed to the fires. But 6 of those were firefighters. 3 of them were aerial firefighters that were out here as part of our firefighting fraternity from America, and 3 of them were volunteers. And there's nothing more confronting, there's nothing more tragic than having to know that. And for me, you know, the burden of command weighs heavily on my shoulders. And when my team and my people are out there, and the worst happens, I feel that loss very deeply, very personally, and as has been very public, spent a lot of time with their loved ones and their little toddlers and their families, and that was extraordinarily difficult, as well as getting out and visiting people. So it does weigh heavily, but you stay focused. It's a big team effort. Ultimately, it's not about you. It's actually about the team and the people, and doing the very best you can. And yeah, like Brendan, it is uncomfortable ducking out and going places and being recognised. And I think one of the most uncomfortable examples is when I went out with my wife in one night after all the fires. We went up just to the local, one of the restaurants here in town, and we went to pay the bill, and someone had already paid for it, and we weren't allowed to pay the bill. So little things like that I found really uncomfortable, because it's not what it was about. But it is lovely. It's a way of people saying thank you, but you're just one piece of a big jigsaw puzzle, a massive team of people that are pulling together in some of the most challenging and confronting and darkest of moments. It's a privilege in so many ways, and spending time with those that are suffering so much loss, there's something very sacred and something very special about that that'll stick with me forever.
Thanks, Shane. Kate, you know, this has been an extraordinary time for doctors, having to digest constant updates, constant preparation, a complete change in the way we practice. How have you dealt with the sleepless nights, concern, worry, and organisation over the last couple of months?
Look, I think it echoes some of the things that Shane and Brendan have just said in any case, and that is about having an amazing team, a community of really good, strong, effective people who work together to get it done. So I've got 4 practices, and across my practices there's about 50 staff that are part of my team. And no single one of us is indispensable or is utterly critical to getting everything done. It is the team that gets it done. There is a little bit of permission to maybe some days not be perfect and not be as fabulous as you would like to be every single day, because if you're not, that's okay. You've got a team, you've got a community behind you to carry you through, and maybe to bridge the gap between your imperfection today and the next day. You have to trust your team and delegate to them sometimes to allow them to carry you through. Do the best you can, and go to sleep at night, hopefully sleep, knowing that you have done the best you could have done that day, given the circumstances ahead of you and in front of you. Yeah, look, that's what I think it's about. It's about working together as a team and not carrying too much of it on your own.
Thanks, Kate. Some more questions for Brendan on testing, but I'll summarise them all into, could there have been more of a role, or is there a role more in the future for testing international arrivals as they turn up?
Really good question. So the testing someone on arrival obviously is just a point in time. They could still be incubating, and it doesn't obviate the need to quarantine. But we are now actually testing people in quarantine on day 10, and we're just looking now at whether we might test people on day 5 or 6, because most of the cases have appeared in that first week. And the reason we're testing people in quarantine is some people in quarantine have deliberately not volunteered symptoms so that they can get out of quarantine. And as you know, most people have very mild symptoms. So we are doing some testing of all quarantined international arrivals now across the country, but it's no substitute for a period of quarantine, because you could still be incubating, and a negative PCR on arrival is not going to help that.
Thanks, Brendan. And quickly, with the social distancing and hygiene education that's been rolled out associated with COVID, do you think there's a role for doing that with obesity or blood pressure management or something like that in the future?
A really good question. I mean, one of the interesting things is that our flu season has completely disappeared with social distancing. It's just gone. We're not finding flu, and it's an interesting reflection on we've never been able to achieve that in flu seasons in the past. We've not been able to stop people going to work or being tested. So I think there are some lessons to be learnt from the significant investment in community education and the comms packages, and that's certainly something we would look at the end. How effective it would be without the burning platform of a pandemic, I don't know, but I think it's a good question.
Right. We'll keep going along with just a couple more questions before we finish up. Do any of you see any great changes that you might make to the way disasters are handled in Australia overall, that we could perhaps teach others overseas at the moment? And I suppose from that, because it's a very long question, is there anything that Australia can do to assist the countries that are really struggling at the moment in Brazil, the US, those sorts of things? Brendan, might go to you first.
So in terms of the second bit, I think one of the interesting reflections on our success is that we've probably got 5,000 ventilators that we will never use. We've probably got surgical masks that would last us for some years. And while obviously we've got to be careful about resurgence and being prepared, we're starting to look at what we can do, not so much for the US and Brazil, but more in our region. We've got, PNG, which has a terrible health system that's got outbreaks. Indonesia is in a lot of trouble. We've got an excess supply of PCR tests, and we are working with DFAT on what aid we can do in our region. So that's and in terms of being better prepared or for future, I think one of the enduring things that will happen after COVID is the National Cabinet. This idea that, in the past, COAG was a pretty staged meeting of premiers and the PM arguing about money. The functional effectiveness of this National Cabinet, with the First Ministers getting together on their own, just with a bewildered doctor in the room, and actually working out how to make stuff happen. I think they are very committed to being able to set up such an enduring function to deal with tricky issues. So I think that will be an enduring issue. We will obviously do things in terms of public health outbreak response. We'll be looking very much at our national medical stockpile, whether we should restructure that in the future, looking at our vaccine production, all that sort of stuff. But so there's a whole lot of things we will look at.
Shane, any lessons for our international friends who are struggling at the moment that they can learn from Australia?
Yeah, I think there is some lessons. So very similar to what Brendan's talking about, but I think some of those global issues around supply chain management issues and how we carefully consider and scenario plan needs and requirements and contingencies in the event of traditional models or the current practices being compromised. We do have a pretty good track record in the foreign emergency space of helping our international partners. We have long-standing reciprocation arrangements with resource sharing and those sorts of things. But some of the challenges we've got, and in New South Wales, we're the only jurisdiction that actually had the government start buying dedicated assets that are being shared across the globe, which are only finite in number, like the large water bombing aeroplanes, for example. And I think we need to rethink that going forward in terms of what's our national capacity, rather than relying on longer fire seasons in the Northern Hemisphere and longer fire seasons here in Australia and how they overlap. So there's no doubt collaboration and information sharing and resource sharing will continue to evolve into the future, and there will be lessons learned. There must be lessons learned out of the tragedy and the damage and destruction for this season. And there's a number of independent reviews going on right now into the fire season, including state-based reviews and the National Royal Commission and those sorts of things. So public information and warnings. Some of our international colleagues that we hear during the fires from Canada, from America and from New Zealand, they were pretty blown away about how quickly information from a fire-affected field gets through to a state level and is broadcast in messages to those affected in very close to real-time information. Having said that, here, we're also already saying we want betterment and we want improvement in that arrangement and in that system. And I think the season highlighted how increasingly we are dependent on the interplay between infrastructure, technologies, power, road networks, and in some quarters, there's a real limited capacity to function without things being normal. So the resilience across society, across individuals, across families, businesses, and communities is something that we've got to have a good refreshing look at and understand. You know, are we really prepared? Because there is an underlying culture in Aussie, she'll be right, mate, it won't happen to me. But when it happens, it really dislocates a lot of what we take for granted, and hardening up some of our infrastructure, creating more resilient infrastructure, and then more particularly communities, is something that we will take out of this season, learn and share with others, I have no doubt.
Thanks, Shane. Kate, any thoughts for our international friends and colleagues?
Yeah, so the first thing that occurred to me was there are international colleagues who have perhaps the capacity to do things in the way that we've done them with such great success, but have ended up not doing them that way and have some pretty awful results. So just keep doing what we're doing, first of all, and lead by example to show how it can be done. And that's a really helpful way that people can observe. I think it's also really important for us to recognise there are those places that don't have capacity to do what we've done. And that's in that HADR, the humanitarian assistance and disaster response space that we will help. And that comes back to our volunteerism and be ready to help. I think also it's really important that we don't get judgy on people and say, well, you know, you should have done it our way and you've done it wrong now and that's your own fault. We will, I think, always be ready to step in and assist if anyone asks us. So our 5,000 spare ventilators, chances are someone might like to use them. And I don't think we'll be backwards in allowing that to happen. So our doors will remain open. We'll keep leading by example, and we'll put ourselves forward to help, I think. I think that's what we can do on the global stage.
Thanks, Kate. A couple of questions about the difficulty across such a big country of having different messaging. Brendan, this one might be really for you. Why not change the way, you know, the Commonwealth works and have one chief medical officer speak for the whole of the country, or have a CDC or something similar, so that we have one overwhelming federal response instead of getting you saying one thing and some state health ministers and chief medical officers saying something different?
So I think we have to live with the reality that we are a federation and it's not going to change, and we have to make that work for us. So I must say that I did have a little bit of a chuckle talking to the AMA Federal Council. Had been pushing for a CDC, you know, saying that, well, a CDC didn't necessarily put America in the best position. But the reality is that a federation is here to stay. And I think the differences between the jurisdictions have been at the margins. I think HPPC, which is all the jurisdictional chief health officers, I think we've had on one occasion in one meeting of about 40, one jurisdiction with a dissenting view, but wasn't really material. So whilst there have been differences in messages, some of that's due to the local epidemiology, some of it's due to local politics. But I think in the main, the critical message with physical distancing was stay at home except for the following 4 reasons. And the whole country bought into that. So sure. And some of the stuff about schools that was a bit untidy. But we've got there in the end. And I think that's what counts.
Thanks, Brendan. So question for the whole panel, and we'll take it in turns. With the bushfires affected communities, throughout the country, then rolled by another crisis in the form of COVID, how do you think that will impact the ability of these communities to move into a recovery process? And how will the government be able to help with that, do you think? Shane, you might want to answer this one first. You're on mute still, Shane.
I thought I hit it, sorry. Look, to answer that question, Adam, I would first qualify by saying it's far more than bushfires and COVID here in New South Wales, and not exclusively New South Wales, dare I suggest it. So if you look at the last 6, 8, 12 months, we've seen lots of communities on their knees with the drought. The drought has had a profound effect on rural and regional New South Wales, continues to do so. There's some modicum of relief in different areas, but then a lot of those same communities were belted with the bushfires in an unprecedented way, largely given the antecedent conditions created by the drought and the lack of moisture in the landscape. We had a very volatile landscape, and the unprecedented weather resulted in the relentless nature of that. And even up in the north, a lot of areas were still recovering from fires in February, March, and we went straight into, in the middle of drought, June, July, August, in the middle of winter, over 1,000 fires a month in New South Wales. So a particularly dry landscape. Then in a lot of areas that were not only drought affected, bushfire affected, to break some of that weather up, they were heavily impacted by floods and storms. And now, ubiquitously, we've got everybody implicated through the COVID pandemic, and the implications of that, the restrictions and what have you. So the compounding effect of disasters and disruptions has had a profound effect on communities in so many ways. And whilst the default goes to the physical elements, the landscape, the buildings, the bridges, the infrastructure, all those sorts of things, the reality is at the core of it, it's all about people. It's all about people and their emotional and psychological well-being, their broader health, and whilst the COVID is occurring, it's not stopping the recovery effort rolling out. And as a matter of fact, in my new role, looking at the extraordinary work that's going on, locally delivered, whilst we've had an unprecedented period, it's also being matched with an unprecedented level of support programs and measures available like we've never seen before in our history going out. The challenge is getting out there and ensuring those that need the assistance are accessing or being afforded the assistance. And here in New South Wales, just in the last couple of weeks, quite aside from all the additional announcements on investments and programs, but there's a deliberate attempt to what we call an outreach program, where we're trying to target through local councils and through local community groups and bodies to effectively sweep the communities to try and make sure we are capturing and identifying everybody who's been impacted and affected. Have they got the right levels of assistance? Are they securing it? If people think there is somebody in the community that's not getting it or what have you, we really need to work very hard in a restricted way with the amount of movements and inclusion, how we get to and reach these people. The other thing around psychological and emotional well-being, mental health matters, a lot of local events were being programmed to pull people together, to let them share and experience and make sure that we reduce the stigma of not feeling okay and struggling and being challenged and all those sorts of things. And often that centres around local existing community constructs, whether it's the CWA, the men's sheds, the local footy club, whatever it is, the pubs. And that's been really challenged right now. So there's this real challenge through virtual connections and those sorts of things. So we're very mindful, quite aside from all the physical building, that the welfare and the well-being of people is critical, given the compounding nature of disasters and disruptions over the preceding months.
Thanks, Shane. Kate?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Look, coming out of the bushfire crisis, we saw some pretty early mobilisation, I suppose, and deployment of resources to communities, particularly in things like social supports, mental health supports, and some rebuilding sort of things. And so I can speak a little bit. I'm chair of the board of Lifeline South Coast, and we had increased funding to be able to answer the phones for people in crisis and people in need coming out of the bushfires. What we've seen is that those resources provided to us at Lifeline South Coast and other services, rolling forwards through the pandemic now and through COVID, we're continuing to receive 25-30% more calls than we would have expected on that number. Now, we have that in place now because of the bushfires, and it's just continuing to be funded, which is fantastic. What I'm seeing with that, though, is that if we provide the resources, the funding and the support to that community will be able to look after itself. It is going to be able to recover. It's going to be able to grow its skills for the next time around and prepare better. So I think in terms of moving into recovery and how the government's going to be able to support that recovery, teach a man to fish. Don't just give them a fish. Don't fly in an AUSMAT team. Provide training and support to the local doctors, because we're going to be there forever. We're going to be there for the long haul. The FIFO support, maybe not so much. And we can see that that's working. It's translating on the ground to communities that are better able to look after themselves, prepare themselves, respond and recover. It's built in, it's embedded. And I think the governments can really develop that and grow that theme to make a big long-term structural difference to the way we respond to these emergencies.
Thanks, Kate. Brendan?
Yeah, so I think the mental health side is one that's really worrying us a lot at the moment. There are people, it's going to take probably some years for full employment. There are people who've lost their jobs through actions we've taken that have never been out of work. And those, particularly those regional communities that have had the double whammy of bushfires, and then they may have been dependent on tourists. We've stopped tourists coming. So we're focusing hugely on mental health at the moment. I've got this stable of deputy CMOs. I've now got a psychiatrist trying to give us some medical leadership in that space, because we do need to supplement all that wonderful work that we have funded through Lifeline and Beyond Blue and those community services. We have to make sure we look after the more acute end of the mental health spectrum too. So that worries us a lot. One of the things that, as the economy recovers, one of the potential benefits of having the borders closed for potentially, God knows, 6-12 months, is that Australians actually take about $20 billion of their money outside of Australia as tourists every year. And once we've got our borders open internally, and once we've made sure that we've got our testing and everything, we're hoping to have a boom in Australian local domestic tourism. There are people like me who've still not been to Kakadu, but have been many times to Europe. And so I think that will hopefully be a really good thing for the rural and regional community. But the mental health situation does worry us enormously.
Thanks, Brendan. We're starting to look at wrapping up soon. So I might just ask each of our panel members for any final thoughts or observations. Kate, I might ask you first.
Sure, thanks. Look, I think we have to just keep reminding ourselves that this is a long game. That there's a lot ahead of us. We're not done yet. We haven't succeeded. We are on the pathway to success. The curve is flattened, but it's not gone. And I think we need to just remember that we've got a lot of work ahead of us, and not to exhaust ourselves in the early stage by overdoing it and over committing ourselves early in the piece. There's a long time to run on this. At the same time, I say this to people a lot, is I still have burnt leaves in my backyard, and the rest of the world is going to continue. Summer will come back, there will be more bushfires, other things will happen, people will still get sick from cancer and from heart disease and things. So while we focus on the pandemic and what we can do to keep the curve flat and keep it down, we mustn't forget that there's a whole lot of other things that we've got to continue as well. And we can't ignore those continuing too. So maintain our vigilance, I suppose. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Shane, any last thoughts with us?
Look, I agree with Kate. This is a long haul, and I think that the key for us across community is to assure people they're not forgotten. And what I mean by that is, in New South Wales, the amount of people that I've spoken to locally in the last few months, those affected by the drought feel they were forgotten when bushfires started to dominate. In the bushfire space, the people up north affected by bushfires thought they were forgotten because all the attention was down south with the bushfires. And now with COVID, everyone's saying, oh, they've forgotten about us in the drought and the bushfires. So as Kate said, the care and attention and the support for people is going to be enduring for a long time. There's a lot of physical rebuilding to do, but there's a lot of emotional and psychological nurturing care and rebuilding to do across communities right around affected areas over the last 3 to 6 months. The other challenge is, and I'm a big advocate for promoting exactly what Brendan said, and that is about getting people out travelling. Whilst we talk about economy and some people say economy versus health, it's not. They're so closely intertwined, and a viable economy leads to well-being, purpose, belonging, jobs, employment, all those sorts of things. The mental health is just so important around viable economies. But we know there's a lot of rural and regional areas, and particularly the more remote and isolated communities and some of the vulnerable communities, there's a level of apprehension and necessary and understandable apprehension about movement and visitation, even though they've got this vexing challenge of knowing they're depending on it and relying on it to be viable and engage in society. So there's a lot of complexity and challenge going forward, and we've just got to stay the course.
Thanks, Shane. Brendan.
So I might use this to my own end a little bit. Two things. One is, as you know, I'll probably move into the Secretary of the Health Department role in a few months when the PM lets me. And I'll get back to one of my big passions, which is primary care reform. And I do want us to think about what we've learnt in the last few months. Things like, what's the future ongoing enduring role of telehealth, how we can make for a strong and viable primary. This is probably my biggest reform goal, is to get a really vibrant, strong, viable primary care system that young doctors want to be part of. So put your minds to that. Feed me your ideas. I know the RDAA is feeding them all the time. The other thing that I would say is, if we're going to get through the next 12 months, the single biggest, most important thing, I said this to the presidents of the medical colleges just the other day, every doctor in Australia has to be focused on making everyone they see who has a cough or a cold or a sore throat or a sniffle get a COVID test. That is the way we will manage to identify, and people will turn up in all sorts of funny places. We just had some people turn up in South Australia for the first time today, and some people coming off a cattle ship from UAE and WA. So if every doctor in Australia has that front of mind, we've got plenty of tests, and tells everyone they've got to go and have a test, or swabs them and sends it off, or gets them to self-collect, whatever, that will be, and the general practice is the key to that. And if I can make a plea for us to be incredibly alert collectively over the coming months, that'll get us through. And can I thank you for the wonderful work you guys are doing. And I think, you know, the rural doctors are just such a crucial part of the fabric of our health system. And I'm always interested in your ideas and how to make it better. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Brendan. I'd like to begin to wrap up soon. So first of all, we're going to try and follow up your questions offline. There are heaps of questions we've still got that I didn't quite get to, so we'll try and follow those questions up for you. I'd like to thank our panellists tonight for being with us. A lot of the questions that were asked were really questions of thank you. So thanks, Kate, for being with us. Thanks for taking the time out of your practice to join us. I really want to take the time to thank Shane for the extraordinary work that he did as New South Wales Rural Fire Commissioner. On behalf of rural doctors and GPs everywhere, we'd like to thank you for the work you did and wish you luck in your new role as the Resilience Commissioner in New South Wales. Brendan, on behalf of rural doctors, rural GPs and doctors all over Australia, I want to thank you for the extraordinary work that you have done as the Commonwealth's Chief Medical Officer. You've done an extraordinary job, and we're all very proud of the work you've done. Australia is in the position it is in the world really as close to the #1 country when you look at the numbers every day, like I do, as really leading the world, and our response has been fantastic. And to all those people who say part of that is luck, yes, a little bit of it's luck and a lot of it's really good planning and really good leadership. And I want to thank you for your leadership. Thanks for taking the time away from your family tonight to join us and answer questions from rural doctors right across Australia. Our heart thanks for you, mate. Well done. I'd like to again thank all our family, all our panel members. Thanks very much for your time tonight. If you want to see recording of this, it's available will be available soon on the ACRM and RDAA websites. Please check out tomorrow's COVID-19 bulletin. And if you've got the time and you've tuned in tonight, please do one of our evaluations, because that helps us plan future ones. Any future suggestions or messages you want us to convey, please email the RDAA or ACRM teams, and we can pass those questions on. Registrations will soon be open for next Tuesday's webinar. Panel will bring together all the main presidents and chairs of two organisations to talk about how life will look beyond COVID. Dr. Norman Swan has again agreed to host our final webinar series in this particular series. So that should be a really good one, looking at life beyond COVID. And again, thank you to the team behind the scenes who put this together. Peter Rutherford and Marita at RDAA and at ACRM, and all the team, Michelle Cooper, Inika, all be working behind the scenes that make these webinar series possible. Thanks to everyone who took the time to join us tonight. We've really appreciated your support throughout this webinar series. And again, if you've got any questions or anything that we can help with, please email or ring our office. Thanks for joining us tonight, everyone. Have a safe, stay safe and good night.